This series is based on a true story. Douglas Hilton hurried to meet Susan, who together with her husband was in a difficult situation. Susan now wants everyone to know the truth. While Douglas is not yet the official attorney for the couple, he may take on their case soon. Currently Susan and her husband are in prison. The events then take us back some time. Englishwoman Susan, who speaks French quite well, enjoys buying various useless trinkets. It brings her pleasure. Meanwhile, her husband Christopher received a letter. The spouses live very modestly in France. Christopher is currently trying to improve his French in order to find a job. When Susan showed her husband a poster bought in an antique shop, he reminded her that they needed to save money. Christopher opened a letter from Gerard. There were €100 in the envelope. However, Christopher doesn't think it will change anything because they have significant rent debts. If Christopher doesn't find a job urgently, they could end up on the streets. Sometimes Susan remembers the past. She and her husband share a terrible secret that they have kept for all these years. Susan tries to support Christopher, believing that he will soon find a job. Christopher went for another interview but again was rejected due to poor French language skills. Meanwhile, Susan hung the poster on the wall. Christopher was on the brink of despair, and to avoid disappointing his wife, did not hurry home. He finally read a letter from his longtime friend, the actor Gerard Depardieu, who wrote that one must never lose hope. If you see beauty in every day, life will immediately change for the better. Instead of helping her husband, Susan walks around the city dreaming of shopping. Not knowing what to do, Christopher decided to call someone. Susan is sure that her husband has already found a job and is waiting for him at an open-air cafe to celebrate the occasion. But instead, Christopher called his stepmother Tabitha and told her about his financial problems. But that's not all that's troubling Christopher. He confessed that many years ago he became an accomplice to a crime and asked his stepmother not to report it to the police. Arriving to meet his wife at the cafe, Christopher lied that the interview went well and he might get the job. But before his first paycheck, Christopher wants to borrow money from Tabitha. Susan is adamantly against it, as in that case they would have to tell Tabitha why they moved here. Thus their crime committed in the past could be revealed. Eventually Christopher agreed with the wife, unaware that Tabitha had just called the police and reported that her stepson confessed to burying his wife's parents under Nottingham 15 years ago. Now Tabitha would like to know if there was a report of the disappearance of the couple, William and Patricia Wycherley, at that time. Police officer Emma Lansing informed her boss about 2 bodies that might be in the backyard of a house in Mansfield. According to the woman's stepson who contacted the police, it was not a crime but an accident. Learning that Tabitha had turned him into the police, Christopher had to tell the wife about it. Christopher was very disappointed because he didn't expect such treachery from his stepmother. He thought Tabitha would lend him money if she knew about his dire situation, but everything didn't go as planned. It seems now the spouses have no choice but to move again. Susan immediately began to pack. She was very angry with her husband, shouting that he should have protected her. For Christopher, Susan was even ready to live on the streets, but now perhaps, it's all over for them. Meanwhile in Nottingham, police officers Emma Lansing and Paul Wilkie arrived at the address received from Tabitha and questioned the new homeowner, Danny, as well as his neighbors. Everyone described the Wycherleys as unsociable people. Neighbors think that 15 years ago, the Wycherleys moved to Ireland, after which their son-in-law Christopher looked after the house for a while before selling it. Another neighbor, Nigel Berman, saw Christopher digging a hole in the garden and joked that he buried his father-in-law and mother-in-law there. However, now Nigel wasn't so amused. The house was cordoned off, and a team of experts began their work. Senior Detective Inspector Tony Collier made a television statement, urging Christopher to contact them. It's in their mutual interest not to disturb the French authorities. The Edwards couple know they are being sought, but instead of solving the problem, they watched an old movie as if nothing had happened. Experts continued searching the former Wycherley property, while Christopher decided to email Inspector Collier, promising full cooperation in the matter. However, Christopher made it clear that he and his wife have no intention of returning to the UK anytime soon. 2 bodies were soon found in the garden of the house in Mansfield, as yet unidentified. The circumstances of their deaths are to be determined by forensic experts. Currently British police don't have sufficient grounds to arrest the Edwards couple, especially since they are in another country. Obtaining a European arrest warrant is not so simple. The only evidence is the bullets in the garden, but that's not enough. However, Tony Collier is determined to solve this case. Emma, like Paul, is convinced of the Edwards' guilt. It remains unclear why Christopher told his stepmother about it in the first place. And even if Christopher is innocent, the question remains why he buried his father-in-law and mother-in-law in the garden. This incident is widely covered in the media, making Christopher and his wife nervous. Susan doesn't seem like a grieving daughter at all, thinking that her husband will soon go to work. At this point, Christopher admitted that the interview went horribly. However, this is not the worst of their problems now. In Christopher's opinion, if they continue to hide, they will definitely be considered guilty. After receiving expert reports, the police could confidently say that it was not an accident but deliberate crime. Patricia and William each received 2 bullets. Christopher and Susan can only wait. Perhaps the police won't find convincing evidence against them. Would they change the past if they could? Nobody knows. In the evening, they had a romantic candlelit dinner and drank wine. At one point, Susan couldn't hold back and burst into tears, saying it was her fault. Susan believes she ruined the husband's life. Christopher hugged his wife, reassuring her and saying that she is his life. Together they will overcome everything. Sorting through the belongings, Susan found an old photograph of her parents. That same evening, the spouses burned all potential evidence that could point to them. Before going to bed, they prayed. Soon the couple decided to return to the UK and immediately notified the police. They will defend their innocence to the end. Learning that Christopher and Susan intend to surrender voluntarily right at the train station, Tony Collier ordered the transport police to be ready. The only request from the Edwards was for the UK authorities to book tickets for them. Of course the police complied with the request. Before boarding the train, Susan hesitated. The husband begged her to be prudent. However, once on the train, Susan felt relieved. Now their top priority is to stick to the plan and convey their version of events to the public. Since there was no point in saving money anymore, Susan decided to spend their last funds. Meanwhile, Tony, Emma and Paul are waiting for the suspect's arrival and preparing for their arrest. Bringing coffee to her husband, Susan said she saw Gerard Depardieu in the restaurant car. Perhaps he came there from the business class. Christopher thought it wasn't Gerard but just someone who resembled him. The police are already at the airport awaiting the train's arrival. Susan fell into a restless slumber, while Christopher couldn't sleep. Their past haunts them both. Susan's parents often argued. Family relationships were complicated. Hearing her husband cry, Susan became worried. Christopher said he was stronger than he seemed. They won't say goodbye, believing they can be together as free people. The police fear missing the prime suspects. It's possible that all of this was their trick to escape. However, the spouses don't plan to flee. They passed by one of the officers without even noticing. Seeing the suspects, Emma reported it to her boss. Meanwhile, the spouses went over the plan again. They agreed not to speak to the police without a lawyer and not to succumb to pressure during interrogations. Christopher and Susan surrendered to the police without resistance. The past continues to haunt the spouses as if it all happened yesterday. They kept this secret for many years. Perhaps if Christopher hadn't slipped up, no one would have ever known the truth. Both spouses were arrested. Earlier they agreed to tell only the truth, but what is their truth? While in the prison cell, Susan is very scared. Christopher, on the other hand, has already resigned himself to the situation and is just glad to have a roof over his head and free meals. Finally, Susan was allowed to meet with her lawyer, who advised her not to say anything to the police. If the spouses remain silent, there is a chance they will be released before the trial, although Douglas cannot give any guarantees. The problem is that suspects are prohibited from exchanging ideas, so Christopher won't be able to learn about their plan. Douglas suggested that his client draft a short statement. She briefly described her day before the demise of the parents. Emma and Paul are nervous, fearing that the suspects won't cooperate. Over 15 years, they have likely meticulously planned their false story down to the smallest details. The detectives prepared for the interrogation. While Christopher calmly ate in the cell, Susan recounted to the police all the words she had spoken with her lawyer earlier. Susan claimed that her mother took her father's life by firing a gun. Susan in turn took the mother's life because she forced her to. It was just self-defense. At that time she was 39 years old. Susan insisted that her husband had no involvement in this. To all the police questions she replied no comment, as advised by the lawyer. In general there was no constructive dialogue, but the fact that the couple is friends with Gerard Depardieu seemed curious to the police. Susan was very polite with the prison staff. No one could imagine that she was capable of anything terrible. Susan recalls being on a date with her future husband at a theater in the past. They had a great time, and after the play they went to a cafe for hot chocolate. Christopher and Susan were truly in love with each other. They were so engrossed that they missed all the buses and trains. Susan was worried that the parents would be angry with her. When Christopher suggested she stay the night at his place, she agreed. In the present, Susan misses her husband dearly. Christopher was ready to answer questions without a lawyer. He has no intention of listening to someone who doesn't even know him. Christopher explained that in May 1998, his wife went to visit her parents in Mansfield, while he stayed home in London. He only learned about the tragic events that happened a week ago on the following weekend. They decided not to report to the police and bury Susan's parents in the backyard. If the story checks out, Susan could get up to 8 years in prison for allegedly acting unintentionally. Christopher, on the other hand, will get about a year for obstructing the investigation. Of course, the police do not believe that it was an unintentional act. Emma asks the boss for permission to personally interrogate the suspects to confuse them. Susan still did not answer the detective's questions, but when she learned that her husband had refused the services of a lawyer and agreed to cooperate with the police, it threw her off. Things didn't go as planned for Susan and Douglas. It was supposed that Christopher would also remain silent, but apparently he has a different opinion on this matter. Next, Emma questioned Christopher, who recounted how 15 years ago he received a call from his wife in the middle of the night, saying she wanted to return home to London immediately. Her mother, as usual, was drunk and quarreling with her father. When Christopher met his wife at the bus station, she didn't say anything about what had happened, she only mentioned that the weekend was terrible. Susan also wanted to order alcohol, which was unusual considering she hardly ever drinks. For a week, Susan didn't tell the husband that her parents were no longer alive. He is now convinced that Susan only took her mother's life and acted in a state of shock. Emma found these arguments unconvincing because, according to the report, the shots were fired at the same angle, indicating that most likely it was done by one person. A week later, on Friday, the spouses went to Mansfield together. That's when Susan told her husband about what happened. In the house of his wife's parents, he allegedly did not immediately notice a suspicious odor because of the cigarette smoke. The interrogation was over. Tony was informed that on May 5, 1998, a joint account was opened in the name of Susan and Patricia Wycherley. When the detectives demanded explanations from Susan, she didn't know what to say. Considering that immediately after the crime, Susan withdrew all the money from the account in cash, her greedy motive is evident. Christopher defended his wife to the last, insisting that she never intended to harm anyone. She always had more important concerns than money. In the past, when Susan first spent the night at her future husband's house, his mother was sleeping drunk on the couch in the living room. After wishing each other good night, Susan and Christopher went to different rooms. They had breakfast together the next morning. Christopher's mother offered them coffee. Thanking the woman for her hospitality, Susan was about to leave. By the way, she met Christopher at a marriage agency. It was his mother who sent him there to find a soulmate. Christopher escorted his beloved. When Susan returned home, her old strict parents refused to open the door. Hearing the argument, Christopher returned. They haven't been apart since. In the present, while Christopher was in his cell, Susan was brought in for questioning again and asked to tell in detail what happened on that fateful night. However, Susan still refused to communicate with the police. The lawyer strongly advised her not to answer any questions. Emma acted wisely and decided to play on the suspect's feelings, saying that the husband called her act of accessing the bank account greedy. The detective also hinted that they knew that on the night of the tragedy, the mother revealed some secret to Susan. Barely holding back her emotions, Susan recounted that she was awakened by shots that night. Susan immediately realized that something bad had happened. Her father lay lifeless on the floor, and her mother was very drunk, saying that she could no longer tolerate the husband's antics. Patricia had always hated both the husband and daughter because they reminded her of a terrible past. Many years ago, William had committed actions against Susan that were unacceptable. It was a surprise for Susan to learn that her mother had been aware of all this time. When Patricia shouted to her daughter that no one had ever loved her, Susan couldn't take it anymore and fired a shot. However, Emma wasn't convinced because, considering the moment with the bank account, everything looked like a deliberate crime. Susan, on the other hand, continued to insist that she did it in a moment of emotion and that Christopher was not involved. He just wanted to protect her, so he took the burial upon himself. The husband was the only one Susan ever felt safe with. Many years ago, before their wedding, Susan told Christopher about her difficult childhood. It brought them together forever. Christopher was a good shooter, and that's a fact. But does that make him guilty? At first glance, Christopher and Susan seemed like the most ordinary couple. They loved old movies and the actor Gerard Depardieu. No one could ever imagine that for 15 years they had kept a terrible secret. The detective questioned Dr. Tabitha Edwards, Christopher's stepmother. According to her, Christopher had every chance of getting a higher education but didn't want to leave his mother. After the wedding, Christopher and Susan completely cut themselves off from the rest of the world. They were both quite strange and seemed to not belong to this reality. Tabitha claimed that her stepson had always been vulnerable. She never really interacted with the Wycherley spouses. All Christopher's life he had a need to save someone, but he always failed. After Christopher's brother David passed away, he fell into deep depression. To cheer up her husband, Susan wrote a letter to their favorite actor Gerard Depardieu, asking for a signed photo. The detectives are trying to reconstruct the events of the fatal night in detail, considering all the causal relationships. The fact that Susan left her lifeless parents under the bed and lived an ordinary life for a week, leaves no doubt that she is not a victim but a criminal. Now detectives have to prove it. Christopher was again called in for questioning and asked about his personal correspondence with Gerard Depardieu. Christopher explained that once Susan wrote a letter to the actor, and since then, they have been in correspondence. It turned out that Susan spent much more money on all sorts of antique junk than her husband thought. Christopher didn't believe the detectives. However, deep down, he understands that this is true. Once Christopher found a pile of unnecessary things in the cabinet under the sink that Susan had bought. She claimed it was an investment in the future. In addition to all the junk, there was a congratulatory letter addressed to William Wycherley on his centenary. Officially, he lives here, and if someone shows up, the deception will be revealed. Christopher is ready to admit that his wife can be irrational, but Patricia and William are to blame for always trying to deprive her of any chance of happiness. All Susan wanted was to receive love from her parents, but they never gave it to her. Christopher also told the detectives that the Wycherleys' home was jointly owned. When Susan's grandfather passed away, she inherited everything. Patricia received nothing from her father due to his animosity towards William. Once, Patricia complained to her daughter about her terrible life and marriage, while William complained to his son-in-law about his wife. Christopher didn't want to hear it anymore and left the room, overhearing Patricia demanding her daughter to give up the inheritance. In the end, Susan gave in, and agreed to give the parents her share of the house. Right after that, the Wycherleys sold the house for a decent sum and moved to Mansfield. Of course, Christopher was upset by his wife's rash decision. Presently, Douglas told Susan that he would like a marriage like hers. Susan always defends her husband and never lets anyone speak ill of him. The detectives don't believe a word Christopher says, thinking he was in Mansfield when the Wycherley couple passed away. Christopher continued to deny this, but he blurted out that he had not been in London that night, but in Dagenham. From wedding photos provided by Tabitha, it's evident that Patricia was present at the celebration, unlike William. According to Christopher, William did not approve of their marriage. Memories of David make Christopher cry. They were always very close, so David's demise was a real shock for Christopher. Taking advantage of Christopher's moment of weakness, Emma advised him to stop covering for his wife, as it could end badly for everyone. However, Christopher didn't change his mind. He loves Susan and will never stop defending her. Even the fact that Susan withdrew money from her parents' bank account right after the incident is not an argument for him. When Christopher let slip that he used to practice shooting, the police officers were delighted, thinking it could be a solid lead. Christopher claimed Susan was afraid of guns and would never intentionally use it. Christopher was taken to the chamber and Susan was brought in for questioning. In Emma's opinion, in reality, the Wycherleys were afraid of their daughter and her husband. Moreover, all the evidence points to the fact that on the night of the crime, Christopher was in the Wycherley house with his wife, and he was the one who fired the shots, because Susan simply did not know how. Susan vehemently denied everything and ignored her lawyer's advice to take a break. Now her silence won't change anything, and it might even make things worse. Susan is desperate. All she wants right now is to see her husband, but it's not possible yet. Douglas urged her to hold herself together, but it didn't help. Susan continued to sob. To try to salvage the situation, Douglas confessed that he too had been in prison when he was young, but it had no effect. Susan screamed that she only loves Christopher and can't bear to lose him. Meanwhile, the police were celebrating their success. Thanks to their hard work, they had almost solved the double crime. It's worth waking up in the mornings for this. However, Emma's mood was far from festive. She decided to call her father, with whom she had a difficult relationship. In the past, Christopher was amazed to receive a response from Gerard Depardieu. Could such a person really write to an ordinary citizen? This showed Christopher that there is still goodness in the world. At this moment, Susan decided to reveal a secret to her husband. In her childhood, she often ran away from home to avoid seeing her parents fight and watched a horse. Somehow this brought Susan relief. Susan managed to get a pen and paper, and she decided to write a letter to the husband. Susan had never been afraid of losing her place in the real world because there was no place for her here. However, Christopher was completely different, but after their marriage he lost his old life. Now Susan understands this clearly. In court, they listened to the accusations against them. The prosecutor convinced the jury that the version of events presented by the defendants was a fabrication. In reality, they committed a cold-blooded crime and created the appearance that Susan's parents were still alive for 15 years. Sometimes to detach from reality, Susan imagined herself, Christopher and the others as characters in some play, the events of which unfolded several centuries ago. In the real world in court, all the evidence against the Edwards couple was presented. For Susan, it was like watching a black and white movie, intertwined with her strange fantasies. In her imaginary world, she and Christopher hid the bodies in a remote forest, but the mounted police tracked them down. According to an expert, each shot from a revolver requires considerable effort, so accidental firing is impossible. Also, based on the angles at which the shots were fired, it was done by one person. Thus Patricia cannot be involved in the demise of her husband. Susan preferred to immerse herself in the fictional world just to escape reality. It was Christopher's turn to testify. He swore to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Christopher insisted that he had sold both his revolvers before May 1998, and the revolver from which the shots were fired belonged to William. Susan watched all this and didn't believe in the reality of what was happening. The husband sacrificed everything for her, but was she worthy of it? Christopher doesn't hide his enthusiasm for shooting, but he gave up this hobby a long time ago. In any case, an interest in weapons does not make him a criminal. Christopher was always primarily interested in military history. At the prosecutor's request, Christopher explained how a .38 caliber revolver is fired. At that moment, Susan was already far from reality, fantasizing about how she and her husband got into a shootout in the forest. Christopher begged his wife to flee, but she couldn't leave her beloved. Taking the revolver, Susan emerged from cover and began to eliminate the enemies one by one, but suddenly someone wounded her. Susan fell. Christopher saved her at the last moment and ran away. Susan often remembers her childhood, which was far from carefree. Only in a forest could she truly feel free. In court, Susan testified, claiming that she pulled the trigger in a fit of emotions when the mother said many horrible things to her. Then a week later, she and her husband disposed of the casings and the revolver. When the prosecutor announced that a revolver of this type does not automatically eject casings, Susan felt cornered. This proves that she did not shoot. Susan and her husband probably didn't discuss this detail beforehand. She had nothing to say in her defense. No one believes that Susan's parents treated her so poorly. Everything looks like she and Christopher acted purely out of selfish motives. In the fantasy world wounded in the forest, Susan desperately called for Christopher, but he disappeared somewhere. Susan cried when suddenly someone fired a shot. She saw Douglas before her. Susan met with her lawyer. She already understands that it's all over for her and has come to terms with it. However, there's still something Susan would like to confess. In reality, Gerard Depardieu never responded to her letter. Susan forged the actor's signature to please her husband, who was depressed after his brother's demise. All these years, Susan corresponded with Christopher on behalf of Gerard Depardieu. Christopher never recognized the deception. Douglas advised Susan not to disclose this in court because the jurors might misunderstand it. Douglas himself understands that Susan did it out of love for her husband. Douglas also believes that Susan is not a bad person. Much has happened in her life that wasn't her fault, but now nothing can be changed. The prosecutor is convinced that Susan wanted to avenge the parents for depriving her of the inheritance by deceit. Christopher probably fired the shots, but Susan was the instigator, so there is no reason to give them different sentences. During the break, Paul asked Emma if she could imagine what it's like to harm one's own parents. Emma replied that she could imagine it but wouldn't do it. Emma's childhood was no less difficult than Susan's. Her father was often cruel. Once Emma, unable to bear it, even threatened him. Paul wanted to hug his colleague as a sign of support, but she pushed him away, misinterpreting it. Paul tried to salvage the situation and invited Emma to a bar. At first she refused, but eventually agreed. Paul is a really nice guy. In prison, Susan and Christopher have the opportunity to correspond. In his letter, Christopher confessed that he still doesn't fully understand why he told Tabitha everything. Perhaps subconsciously, he was seeking redemption. Christopher doesn't regret marrying Susan at all. They love each other, and no one can take that away from them. Among other things in his letter, Christopher hinted that he always knew about the deception with Gerard Depardieu but didn't mention it because he didn't want to upset her. So that's the ambiguous, absolutely real story. The spouses receive 25 years each in prison, although they still continue to deny their guilt. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.